Hello all, and thank you very much for your time today. I will be presenting on my thesis project, Determining the Enabling Conditions and Actionable Steps in Successful Alternative Livelihood Projects within the Mesoamerican Reef region. This project was in partnership with IMBRC and the Coral Reef Alliance. My supervisor was Dr. Antonella Rivera, the principal investigator for Coral, and the research was funded through the Erasmus Mundus Scholarship. So to begin with, ALPs, or Alternative Livelihood Projects, are projects that promote less environmentally impacting revenue streams to conserve or reduce pressure on natural resources. Over time, these projects have grown to encompass different initiatives such as farming, community capacity building, and small businesses. The thesis project specifically worked to determine the key factors to promote the implementation and success of alternative livelihood projects. The study area was the Mesoamerican Reef region, or MAR region, which begins at the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and continues through Belize and Guatemala, finishing in Honduras. The MAR reef system is the largest barrier-infringing reef system in the Northern Hemisphere, the second largest in the world after the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. Roughly 2 million people are estimated to be very dependent on the barrier reef, and fishing within the region is considered very ingrained into the social and cultural context. No stranger to external climatic events or human-induced challenges, the MAR region has increasingly been impacted by overfishing, rapid coastal development, and environmental degradation. Therefore, fishing resources and revenue are under threat, and ALPs serve as a way to supplement decreasing revenue to fishing. So what drives this research is the currently limited literature documenting ALPs within the region. A wide variety of influential factors within ALPs can often make it difficult to describe and document successful models. So therefore, there is a need to establish a baseline for the region's ALPs and fill in those gaps of information. So that brings me to the research question, which was, what were the factors that made it possible for ALPs to successfully reach their objectives? And to answer this question, the project had three major aims. The first of which was to map ALPs within the MAR region. And as previously mentioned, there is a need for documentation for the current ALPs within the region. So to do this, I identified and confirmed the ALP projects within the region. And the second aim was to determine the factors that enable ALPs to reach their objectives. So documented ALP literature is mostly in terms of assessment and evaluation. So to be first able to analyze the influence of success on certain ALP components, I first needed to identify what the ALP components were for this region. So to reach that aim, I examined the context of ALP progression and implementation to identify the components within ALP progression within the region. And finally, the last aim was to provide ALP implementers with information so that they can adapt successful models into their own projects. To provide this as well, we needed to define what ALP success was within the region and identify which factors contributed to that success. This brings me to my methods. So to first map the ALPs within the region, I started with a general internet search for ALPs that were alternative livelihood projects within the Mesoamerican Reef region, exclusively working with fishers. Using ALPs mentioned in the literature as a starting point, I then branched out into projects and organizations mentioned on their websites. And once satisfying the criteria, these projects were added to a database. This database was then sent to a network of local actors, and they were asked to revise the database. An initial questionnaire was then created to gain general and contact information on these confirmed project actors. The next step was to conduct a literature review to identify the topics that compose project progression. The literature review used the key search word alternative livelihoods or income diversification and fishing. And from the literature, aspects of project implementation and progression were analyzed. 6 key topics were derived from the literature describing ALP components, and the 6 topics became core categories for the interview questions, as well as were used to develop the questions themselves. Moving into the interviews, to understand the project components from the implementers, as well as to have the actors define success and score their projects, interviews were comprised of 13 questions, 12 open-ended questions, 1 closed-ended question, and from the interviews, 6 recurring themes were extracted. These themes explore the concrete decisions of project design that could potentially influence project success and will later be used in a statistical analysis. Semi-quantitative analysis of the number of mention of themes was conducted, and that will be what I will be presenting my results on today. And the final step is still to be determined, where I will be using an ordinal logistic analysis to quantitatively assess the relationship between the success scores and the themes. So moving into the first of my preliminary results, in creating a baseline of information about the ALPs within the MAR region, we contacted 50 actors. Of these actors, an initial questionnaire was sent and 25 initial contact questionnaires were returned. 24 interviews were conducted. However, only 23 were used in analysis because one did not fit the criteria. And the actors described more than one ALP project, so 82 ALPs were documented within this study. The distribution of actors can be seen here in the lower left-hand corner. We had 8 in Honduras and Mexico, 5 in Guatemala, and 2 in Belize. The most amount of confirmed projects was found in Honduras with 30 projects. Moving into the distribution of the types of ALP interventions, the most common ALP intervention within the MAR region that we found were fishery value chains. These types of projects work to strengthen fisheries either through structural management or managing fish stock, and 24 projects documented this. The next most common was ecotourism. These projects worked with diving, tour guiding, or some kind of sport fishing. There were 20 documented projects. And then lastly, the least common were research and monitoring. Only 3 projects were documented within the study, and these projects worked with water quality and fish stock. All 3 of these projects were found in Mexico. And moving into the results for the themes. As mentioned before, the themes are derived through an analysis of the codes and transcriptions of the interviews. They were developed from aspects of project design, and all of them were analyzed through the interviewed projects of the studies. They serve to create actionable steps that can later be identified through the statistical analysis as influential on success. And for the sake of time, I will only be highlighting the levels that are most prevalent within each theme. There are 6 themes, and figure 5 depicts the theme frequency within each topic of ALP progression. So I will begin with management, which is depicted in green. There were 3 levels within this theme. However, co-management was the most prevalent, with 23 projects describing this type of management style. And co-management was defined as an involved power sharing between ALP responsibilities and administration among implementing management and the beneficiaries. Moving into social capital, this theme was the most prevalent theme mentioned within all of the interviews. There were 3 levels within this theme, and the projects demonstrating both horizontal and vertical social capital was most prevalent within 20 projects. Horizontal social capital is defined as the relationships between community members or beneficiaries, while vertical social capital are the relationships between implementing management and beneficiaries. On to long-term funding and support. We had 4 levels, where the most prevalent was seed capital and periphery support, demonstrated by 13 projects. And this level was characterized by an initial capital provided by management, with the idea prior to implementation that management would exit as administration, and then the project would reach some kind of self-sufficiency within a predetermined time frame. Moving on to the next 3, we have knowledge and assets, which had 2 levels. ALP acquired knowledge was the most prevalent with 20 projects, and this meant that beneficiaries gained a skill set with the ALP intervention. However, it is important to note that pre-existing had 19 projects mentioned. Onto complementarity, which had 3 levels, and the most prevalent were 20 projects that emphasized reduction in fishing practices and dependence through the ALP intervention. And lastly, we have conservation mentality, which also had 3 levels, and this was used to describe beneficiaries' willingness to conserve their marine resources. And 22 active conservation mentality projects were demonstrated by concrete, actionable conservation decisions or changes in the beneficiaries' behaviors. Onto the results of the challenges. Challenges described within the themes, management was the most prevalent theme in which challenge topics arose, and that was with 293 mentions. Moving into long-term funding and support, which was the second highest with 145 mentions. And lastly, social capital was the third highest with 107. So the main challenges affiliated with management were project planning, business and financial management with 49 mentions, and increased management support needed. These are the most prevalent challenges amongst the themes. However, the challenges affiliated with management were prevalent within more than one theme. Moving into success, for the project's definitions of success, the most common definition of success was generate income for the community with 142 mentions. And the least common were both improved standard of living and income rotation with only 12 mentions each. And the most prevalent themes within success was social capital. Only 6% of respondents, so the actors who I interviewed, from 2 countries scored their projects the lowest scores, 1 and a 2. 45% of respondents scored their projects as a 4, and these projects were mainly in Honduras. Only 24% of the ALPs described the interviews as a 5, which was a complete success, and these projects were mainly in Mexico. Theme prevalence in high-scoring projects also aligns with high levels of social capital, both in horizontal and vertical, and only horizontal. Now that brings me to my discussion. So the challenges that were most prevalently found were identified in these 3 themes: management, long-term funding and support, and social capital. So particularly the challenge of business and financial management was shared by several themes outside of those 3. And this challenge was reinforced by a lack of social capital. Without social capital, especially vertical capital, beneficiaries are quite weary to involve themselves in financing. Capacity building and interpersonal relationships with our components of social capital are needed for beneficiaries to develop the financing skill set. With this skill set, beneficiaries will have the tools necessary to develop their project's financial sustainability and ensure ALP long-term funding. And we have seen in successful projects that they both have sustainable funding and high social capital. So high-scored projects have established horizontal social capital among the beneficiaries and vertical capital via trust amongst implementing management and the beneficiaries, whereas low-scoring projects indicating a lack of social capital and inefficient project planning. Management recommendations are to consider 2 aspects of social capital for the projects, one being the roles that beneficiaries will have to take on to reach self-sufficiency, and 2, if they have the capacity to do so. Building social capital takes time and should be realistically planned into project design. And to further develop these ideas, the logistic regression will help to understand what themes influence or contribute to success concretely. With this information, we hope to provide implementers with components that carry more weight in the project design and should be emphasized to promote success. That brings me to the conclusions of my projects so far. Traditionally seen as conservation projects, the theme development has shown that ALPs within the region have actually moved their objectives away from exclusively being conservation-based. Instead, we can see them being more affiliated through assisting or supporting coastal communities, either by economic development or capacity building, which is also reinforced by the prevalence of projects within the region working towards diversifying income rather than having fishers stop fishing or change livelihoods. So these findings build on previous literature promoting a change for a broader term for alternative livelihood projects, which I concur with and agree that it should be changed to potentially something like income diversification strategies. Through the research, it was also seen that successful projects trend with bottom-up and co-management styles, which have higher social capital, both vertical and horizontal, which highlights the importance of considering relationship structure and interactions within project design. project financing was a key issue. Beneficiaries need to be given adequate time and tools to manage project financing to reach self-sustainability. So this was repeatedly mentioned by actors, particularly the main limiting factor was the time frame that funding and support comes in. And successful projects exercise active conservation mentality and focus on increasing sustainable fishing practices. Preliminary results also show that the most successful projects are the ones that involve community to actively want to conserve their marine resources and work together towards reducing their dependence on fishing practices. The takeaways from this project are the main baseline and general guidelines for project managers are to consider social capital within every aspect of project design. So thank you very much. That concludes my presentation. I would like to acknowledge my supervisor, Dr. Antonella Rivera, for extreme support during this time, as well as my support system within the project and the program as a whole. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your attention.